Thank you, Deborah. Thanks to B&H for having me today, and thanks to Leica. Thanks to all of you for coming out. It's a fantastic turnout, and thanks to everyone online at home or wherever you're hiding, whatever cave, for tuning in. Before I begin, I'd just like to share the secret of happiness. This is so true. Just say no to anything that makes you sick to your stomach. That's it. It's really simple. It took me 30 years to figure that out. So today I'm going to share with you my documentary project, Fearless Genius, and how I documented in Silicon Valley and the digital revolution. And but before I get to that, I want to kind of walk you through the phases of my career, some of it, and how I got to Silicon Valley. I've been really, really blessed in my career. I got to stand at the North Pole. I was the 3,013th person. I crossed the Sahara. I stumbled into an abandoned leper colony in the Amazon where 30,000 lepers had been rounded up and left without doctors. I photographed the homeless crisis before it began calling that, and the AIDS crisis. I shot presidents, Clinton and Bush, a couple of times. A lot of musicians like Lenny Kravitz and movie stars. This is Charlize Theron in the Congo. And then I learned to take my photojournalism background and documentary skills that I shot for news magazines Time and Life and Newsweek and Forbes and Fortune and USA Today for 2 decades. And I learned to take that skill set and bring it into commercial projects to bring documentary feeling into advertising. And this has been a fantastic kind of merger of art and commerce for me, and it helps pay for my long-term projects. And I've tried to thread that needle of trying to figure out what I really love to shoot, telling stories, being a storyteller, and getting paid to shoot that. It's called merging art and commerce, I guess. It can be done. And by defining myself as a documentary photographer available in advertising, I get just these unbelievably wonderful shoots. Like, you have to come to Dubai and spend a month and document the culture and the people, and Emirates Airlines will pull out ads from that. So, if you define who you are and you really work at that, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy to some degree. Never shoot babies or animals. It's a recent campaign for Allstate. And these pictures here are all from various campaigns. And I'm just really, really proud of the work I do. I don't want to wake up in the morning and be in a box. I don't want to be a commercial photographer. I don't want to be a photojournalist. I don't want to be thought of as one thing. I just want to be a visual storyteller. And some days, after a couple shots of tequila, maybe an artist. We definitely categorize in this country. It's just part of our thing. That's what we do. We put everybody in a box. So part of what I've tried to do is figure out the core of what I'm interested in, which is the human condition and documenting that. And then whether I wake up and I'm shooting pictures of my son, or I have a commercial assignment, or I'm doing a personal work that day, it's just me taking pictures or making films. The last book I did before this was on AIDS orphans in Uganda, and it was about the transformational power of the arts and education to change lives. It's actually good news from Africa about this group of 20 orphans who support 700 orphans in 2 orphanages in Uganda by doing a dance tour in the US. They're very, very interesting kids. They've overcome incredible obstacles to create futures for themselves and get an education through the dance tour. Liz Taylor wrote the intro, and all the money goes to the kids. And I think everything I do has some educational component to it. I just think education is at the root of every social issue, which also led me to Silicon Valley. That was part of the reason I did that. But anyway, I've traveled hundreds of thousands of miles for 30 years. I've been all over the world in search of trying to find beauty and to try to communicate one culture to the wider culture, everywhere from Vietnam and across Asia, Brazil and the Middle East and all over the US. I've been a lot of places, but it's a big world. I haven't been everywhere yet, but I've traveled and I've done some things. I once got to hold a chunk of Einstein's brain in my hand. I once had tea with Stalin's daughter, Svetlana. I've done some things. It's been an interesting life. But you know, the fact is, the truth is that really none of that matters compared to being a witness in Silicon Valley during the digital revolution with the access that I got, where this brilliant hidden tribe of venture capitalists, engineers, and entrepreneurs sparked this explosion of innovation that changed every aspect of our lives. Along the way, they created millions of jobs and untold wealth. They really proved that the power of ideas can become reality given enough willpower, guts, and sheer passion. But as I mentioned, I came to Silicon Valley. I didn't mention this, but I wasn't interested in technology. I got there because I was looking for something more positive to document. I had been a young photojournalist covering the famine and conflict in Eritrea and Africa for Newsweek prior to beginning my story. And I had shot plenty of death and horror by that point in my life, but the scale of this was just something that just exploded my head. The scale of human suffering. You walk into a camp and there's 100,000 people starving to death. I just couldn't get my head around it. And I came back to the Bay Area where I was living, and I began to think about how I could find something tangible progress for the human race and some story that I could cover that gave me hope and actually could help create meaning in my own life. That same year, Steve Jobs was fired from Apple, like a month later. And he announced he was going to build a supercomputer to transform education. And I knew as a journalist, like everywhere you go, education is the key. So that got me interested. Through friends, I reached out and I asked Steve if I could document him with his team. I wanted to understand his process of innovation from inventing the product to shipping the computer. And then I said, I want complete access, day or night, to the R&D labs, to your boardroom, everything you do. And I want to publish it in Life magazine. Oddly enough, Steve actually agreed. And he said yes, and it was the most incredible 3 years. It began a 3-year photo essay. But because Steve trusted me, all doors opened in the Valley, and I ended up going out after 3 years with Steve and getting access to some of the top innovators of the day. I spent 15 years inside Silicon Valley documenting the people inventing the stuff that changed everything. I ended up shooting 250,000 negatives. It's being preserved at Stanford Library. They want to make it a resource for students and historians. And because of the work we've done so far with Stanford, we've been able to get enough scans done that I was able to do the book and we're able to do this project. So today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through the project and give you the talk that I do all over the world with some variations. And then at the end of that, that'll probably take about 5 hours. And then at the end of that, I'm going to walk you through what I hope will be the new model for us and for others to use as visual storytellers. And this isn't a new idea. There's a lot of photographers doing this. Everybody should be trying to do it, I think. You know, the state of photography in terms of assignment work, editorial, commercial, everything has been disrupted by my pals in Silicon Valley and digital. So what is the new model? And that's what I'm exploring with this project, creating a platform of content. So I'm going to walk you through. I'm going to show you our business plan. We're raising money from investors, and we'll talk about that towards the end, and then we'll do questions. So I'm going to begin with the story where I began with Steve. You know, he wanted to put the power of a mainframe the size of a refrigerator into a 1-foot cube. And this was in 1985, very difficult. One day, the prototype arrived, this square cube, and it was out on the table, and everybody gathered around, and it was this square black cube. And no one had ever seen a computer like that before. And I turned to Steve, and I just off the cuff, I just said, so what do you want to do with this thing anyway, Steve? And he just wheeled on me. He's like, I want some kid at Stanford to cure cancer in his dorm room. Okay. But you could see in his eyes, he was so on fire with the possibility that that could happen, that you believed him. It was like a mission to Mars. And because he believed, his team believed. This is the day Ross Perot came. He was trying to raise money. He started the company with his own money. And he said, let's take Ross to the abandoned warehouse where we're going to build the world's most advanced computer assembly line, and no human hands will touch it. It'll all be robots, and we'll give him a formal lunch there. And he did. He was such a great showman even then. And Ross was so ecstatic hearing the story, he wrote a check for $20 million, and they were off to the races. Later, Ross wasn't so happy about that, but Steve is saying, hey, everybody, let's work nights and weekends till Christmas, and then we'll take a week off. In the back of the room, this engineer raises his hand. Steve, we already are working nights and weekends. 90 hours a week is not enough to change the world. So this woman, Susan Kerr, affects your life and my life and millions and billions of people's lives every single day. And usually people don't know who she is. One of the many unsung heroes, women that I met during my time in the Valley. And the reason she's so important is she designed the icons for the Macintosh. Later, she designed the icons for Windows and many, many other operating systems. And to this day, she's still like the icon goddess. This is an actual Steve Jobs to-do list. You get a little glimpse inside his brain. I like the ankle-deep shit at the bottom. You know, interestingly, I had been through a lot at that point. I'd been kidnapped at gunpoint. I'd been through riots, whatever. But standing next to Steve, I was actually terrified. I felt like I was 10 years old because he could see right into your soul. He had this ability to understand your vulnerabilities immediately, like a really good street hustler or a salesperson. You know, he could just get you. And he could use that to his advantage to get you to do what he wanted. But anyway, I was afraid of Steve because I'd always been able to hide behind my camera. But everybody at Next, everyone in that room, he wanted them to be the best in the world, and they had to be able to justify what they were doing there. And I knew that someday, even though he was really good to me, he put me in front of the company and told everybody to let me do what I do, and he trusted me, I just knew that someday he would turn to me and I'd have to justify myself. And I think, you know, all photojournalists, my peers, we were trying to take pictures that could improve the world or maybe even change the world. And we were willing to die to make a picture that could do that. That wouldn't be too big a deal if you could really do that. But that hadn't happened for me yet. And I realized, oh, here are the people right in front of me. These are the people that are changing. They're actually changing the world. You know, I would go to New York and talk to editors and publishers, and they would say, we will never have a computer here. You know, but if you got in the room with these people, you could see the crazy dreams and plans they had. And it was very idealistic then. It wasn't about the money at first. Anyway, once I figured out that I could shoot those people that were changing the world, all I had to do was create a record of this time and these people. That became my purpose. And once I figured that out, Steve was much easier. That's Dan Lewin and Jeff Bork. Steve has come up to them and said, this is at an offsite meeting, and he walked up to them and he said, we need a business plan for selling 10,000 computers a month, like $1 billion a year in business, and I want you to present it to the company in 20 minutes. I love this picture because Steve is outlining the digital revolution. See up here it says analog and digital. It's really interesting. It was really interesting because everything analog became digital by the time I ended my project in 2000. So this really was the digital revolution. I mean, there were certain things that were digital before that, but, oh, look, I created that. I didn't need to do that again. Okay, very good. Anyway, I think there's a perception of Steve that, you know, we put him into this either genius or total jerk category. It's like this weird simplification. And yeah, he could be terrible, he could be really rough, but he also was incredibly sweet, incredibly nice. He was a great teacher. So what I'm talking about here is a human being with layers and complexity who accomplished amazing things. I'm not justifying bad behavior, but I want to at least see him as a human. And but he's really not. I call this Steve Jobs pretending to be human. One of the things I learned about Steve was it was all about trust. You know, we didn't test the audio out on this, so we'll see if the audio works in a second, because I have a clip I'm going to show you. But when he would work with the engineers, if they brought him a technical solution or some design, they'd put it out on the table in a meeting. If he didn't like it aesthetically, or he didn't believe they'd done their homework, or for whatever reason, that's when he could just snap, and he could just start screaming, "This is the stupidest idea I've ever seen," plus some other stronger words. And the person, if they were mature and evolved and they had character, they would say, "Screw you, Steve, this is your answer, it's right here. This is stupid. No, it's not. This is stupid." And that would go back and forth, really, really intense for maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes. And then suddenly this switch would flip in Steve's brain. And he'd smile that smile and go, great, okay, on to the next victim. This is Susan Rockrise, who was very close to Steve, was one of his creative directors at Next. She came from Intel and Esprit, and this is her take, if it works, on trust in Steve.
Well, I have another theory about trust with Steve, and that is that in my own reading and learning about human behavior and interaction with people, I have a phrase that sort of says, hurt people hurt people. And so Steve, for me, as an orphan from his living parents, separated from his biological sister, starts a company, needs to find a way to communicate his emotions, creates machines that are able to be utilized by mere mortals, that are not about communicating about numbers and spreadsheets, they're about communicating the senses and the artistic truth of the individual. It's almost as if these people have a chance to scream their truth through these amazingly easy to use tools based on some need inside of him to tell the truth emotionally that somehow he may have gotten to before he died, I don't know. He gets to Apple and he hires somebody based on what he believes is the right thing to do, which is John Scully for consumer marketing reasons. He wants somebody to help him break through, so technology from Apple's not just technology. And then, boom, he gets outed from the company he found. So that's two orphan experiences, one from his biological family and one from his own company. So by that time, at less than 40 years of age, there's no way in the world that man's going to trust easily.
I love how articulate she is about the absolute, central core of this whole story, which is about inventing tools that unleash human creativity. 1 billion smartphones came online last year, a lot of them in Africa and developing countries. This is going to unleash a tidal wave of creative, amazing technology and solutions. Watch this space. And I think that's the core of what this is about. Human beings have always invented tools going back to the Stone Age, and that's all these are. But they should leverage your brain to create. We'll talk about the future later. I was tempted to go into the singularity, but I'll come back to that. Anyway, the thing she said about John Scully isn't exactly true either. In many ways, Steve wouldn't have had an Apple to go back to if John hadn't done what he did. So we'll get to John in a minute. But jumping ahead, this is 1989, and this is a year after they've announced it, or almost a year, about 9 months after they've announced it. But Steve's run out of money. They haven't built a single computer yet. He hasn't even built the factory yet. He's way behind schedule. And he needs $100 million. He's meeting with Canon, and they're hardballing, and they want to give him half that. Anyway, Steve starts the meeting knowing that he's going to have a tough meeting, and he asks for 6 things that he doesn't want, one after the other. It takes a painful full hour. And the Canon people are bewildered, and the CEO says, wait, I need a break, and he leaves the room. Steve turns to his team, and he goes, you guys have messed this up, and he runs out. I'm changing the language for the internet, sorry. He was a very colorful speaker. 20 years go by, I didn't really know. The board of directors turns to me. I'm standing with my camera after Steve walks out, looking at me. I'm like, what do I know? I don't know what he's doing. So 20 years later, I find out from somebody I was interviewing for the documentary we're working on that he came up to Steve in the hallway, and Steve was laughing, and my friend John said, what are you doing, Steve? Why aren't you in there saving our jobs and getting the money? And Steve said, oh, I was just winding them up. Now I'm going to go unwind. Watch this. And he goes back in, and Canon starts attacking. They're really mad. And one by one, they defeat the great Steve Jobs. They've completely crushed all 6 of these ridiculous demands that he's made. And it's suddenly it was like jujitsu. The power just swept right back across the table to Steve. And they were going to lose face because they had humiliated him. They had to throw him a bone. And anyway, he got the $100 million. He got the robots he promised Ross Perot. It was incredible negotiation. Eddie Lee calls this, he said, Steve had a way of smiling shit at you. And if you saw Steve with this look on his face, it meant he was about to lash out, because he's getting that feeling of, no, I don't really agree with that. And it's just this exact expression that was a warning sign to everybody who knew Steve to get ready. He's going to attack. This is his office. There was so much paranoia even back in those days. Just prior to the launch, so now we're back in '88. And after years of hard work, blood, sweat, and tears, they finally launched the next computer. They got over 80 magazine covers. It was considered a huge success. It had 6 new technologies that hadn't been introduced prior to that, including Wi-Fi and graphics that it had and an optical disc. Never put 6 new technologies in a computer. Just don't do that. Anyway, Ross Perot was all about education, and they were building this computer for the education market. Nobody knew at the launch that it was actually running backstage on a Sun workstation. It wasn't ready. It wasn't ready. They were still trying to figure it out. The interesting thing, though, was that they failed with the hardware. It was a heartbreak. A few years later, they had to shut the factory down. It was an amazing computer, and the World Wide Web was invented on it in 1992 at CERN by Tim Berners-Lee. It was just incredible, and the reason it was so incredible was the operating system. So Steve closed the hardware division, but he never gave up on the OS, on the operating system. And that is at the heart of every Apple product today. That's what got Steve back. By not giving up on the operating system, that was the seeds to his comeback. Even though he almost lost everything and burned through his whole savings, that OS got him back to Apple. Apple needed that, and they bought it from him, and he got a seat on the board. We didn't know, when I started this project, everyone thought it was going to be a slam dunk. We didn't know that Steve was going to struggle and fail for 10 years in the wilderness before making it back. Okay, I like to take a deep breath after talking about Steve. I have to say, just even telling you that story raises my blood pressure about 20 points. But anyway, I moved over to Apple when I got a call saying, we're working on this handheld computer. It'll fit in your pocket. It's a communications device. It's a really cool thing. It's the future. At that point, John Sculley had taken Apple. This was about 1990, 91. After Steve left, John grew the company. Everyone thinks John Sculley killed Apple. John grew the company from 1985 to 1991 to 93. From $800 million a year to $10 billion a year in revenue. It was astonishing what he did with the growth. So I asked John if I could document the Newton team, which was like a rebel unit inside Apple. So Apple was fat and successful. They were the most profitable computer company in the world at this time, more than Microsoft, more than Intel, more than IBM, more than anybody. Nobody knows this, but John Sculley made them the most profitable computer company at that time. I went to John and I said, I'm really interested in this Newton. This sounds like a moonshot. This sounds impossible. You're going to build this thing in a certain amount of time, and I want to document it with editorial independence. And he goes, well, are you going to reveal our mistakes? And it's really hard. And I was like, yes. Oh, well, that would have been good. Anyway, John said, okay, maybe we'll learn something from that. I was like, wow, that's enlightened leadership. So anyway, I got inside the company, and nobody wanted the Newton at Apple. It was all about Macintosh. Nobody wanted this Newton thing. No one knew what it was. So the board was not giving them enough money. So they had this little team, and they were working around the clock. So it was like a startup inside a big company. Very, very hard work. One thing John did, though, that was very interesting was he started hiring women, and he started making them managers. Donna was a manager of the software, and he began really pushing for diversity. Oh, this is Woz showing the early Game Boy to John. Woz is a real hero of Apple. I'm not going to talk about Woz today, but just know that he was the heart and soul behind the whole thing, if you don't know that already. So I became a beta tester for the Newton, and anecdotally, I noticed when they started bringing in women engineers like Sarah Clark, interesting things started to happen. First of all, Sarah came in, had her baby, and didn't leave the building for 2 years that I saw. She would breastfeed. This is the war room at Apple. This tiny unit is trying to build something that had never been for a new market that didn't exist. There was no smartphone market. There was nothing. This was a new idea. And Palm Pilot, at the same time, was furiously working to invent their thing. Okay? Anyway, she would breastfeed behind a curtain. She would sleep while the code was compiling. So as a beta tester, they started bringing women, people of color, all over the world, people from all over the world at Apple, artists and anthropologists, and just different worldviews were around that table. And you'd have the product marketing managers and the engineers talking about deadlines and what features would be in the product and how they would be expressed and how the code would be written. And these arguments became incredibly intense. And guess what happened? The product, for me as a beta tester, got 90% easier to use. You know, there's 3 or 4 studies showing companies that hire women have more women on their boards and more profitable. And I just saw when you get women engineers in there and the worldview changes and people of different ethnic backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds. Remember, Silicon Valley is dominated by 27-year-old white male geeks who just have this very narrow worldview about video games and trying to meet girls or whatever. So your worldview is different, your priorities are different. So I have this t-shirt I'm going to make someday. It says, whoever writes the code controls the machine, which impacts your behavior and the entire culture. Wait, did I digress a long time on that one? I'm just going to jump through. Yeah, never do that when you're on deadline with beta. They're trying to go from beta to golden master, and they were forbidden to do this because there were only 30 engineers on the team. The media is outside in Vegas pounding on the door waiting to come into the demo, and somebody walked up onto the podium and hit send on the fax that they were going to demonstrate, and it crashed. You know, it was really fun. It was intense. They were working around the clock like the next team was. But it was starting to wear everyone out. People were burning out. And like I said, they had 30 engineers writing 1 million lines of code. Compare that to Microsoft, where they had 400 engineers and 4 years. These guys had to write that 1 million lines of code in 1 year. That was their deadline given by the board, who didn't even want this. At the end of that year, for really good reasons, they switched chips. And they told the team, good news, we got this really good chip. It's going to be much faster. Bad news, you have to rewrite all that code all over again. And you have a year to do it. Kohei Sono was a 27-year-old engineer from Japan, just gotten married. And when he heard the news, he went home, he loaded a pistol, and he shot himself in the heart. Which was incredibly difficult, devastating for the team. But they dedicated the Newton to Ko, and they began working around the clock even harder through Christmas, and they made a really key breakthrough, and it allowed them to ship the product on time. So it was this huge emotional catharsis. It was an incredible team effort. Unfortunately, they shipped the Newton too early. The board rushed it out. So the next machine was too late. The Newton was too early. But John Scully's vision for this product was vindicated because he announced that someday billions of people will use smart devices, and he was laughed off stage by the media in Chicago in 1994. But it turns out that he was right. And, you know, even though John was forced out as CEO and fired shortly after the launch of this Newton, he was vindicated. It paved the way for the Palm Pilot. And actually, there's a direct line between the Newton and the iPhone and the iPod and the iPad. You wouldn't have had those things probably if you hadn't gone through the Newton experience of failure. So I went over to Adobe, and you know, for 500 years you had the printing press and incremental improvement until 500 years later these guys spent 20,000 man hours writing the code that lets computers speak to computers and became PostScript. This is John Warrack and Chuck Geschke, the founders of Adobe. They were originally at Xerox PARC. They were part of the Alto team that Steve learned from to create the Mac. And suddenly you really had a revolution. The desktop publishing revolution began. This is Russell Brown. He was the creative back then, the creative director at Adobe, and he still is today. And if you didn't have Russell Brown, you really probably wouldn't have had Photoshop. You wouldn't have it because he evangelized it. There were a lot of people that were really against digital and really against photography. I mean, digital photography. And Photoshop was like a symbol of that. And I would say to them, I'll never use a digital camera. You know, they would tell me, you're going to use a digital camera. Well, we just interviewed Russell for...
In the beginning of time, which was 1985, I didn't have all of the creativity tools that I wanted. I saw computers, but you couldn't touch them. They were like, oh, they learned how to program to touch them. And so the ultimate creative fusion time bomb blew up, and it was the introduction of the laser writer and PostScript, and then Photoshop, Illustrator. So now artists had all of these incredible tools, and there was an explosion of publishing. And it was like the ocean. It came in, washed over all the designers, and they drifted into the ocean and became fish. I want you all to stand up and celebrate creativity!
I can't really explain that. I didn't know that was going to happen, but artists from all over the world were coming to the Valley. Russell was calling up people and bringing them there. This is the very first Photoshop Invitational, and that's David Hockney, one of the world's great painters, trying to figure out Photoshop. I got to sit next to him and learn Photoshop with him. They wanted to know if this technology could give them an edge or help them be more creative, so people were coming in, musicians, all kinds of people were coming to the Valley. So Russell really evangelized it, as they say. Yeah, this is kind of funny, but it really, to me, had this very serious undertone of like, how dare you take a vacation when we're on deadline? I call this howl. It really was a roller coaster, and things accelerated as the 80s turned into the 90s. The wave of money flowing in and the growth of these companies was accelerated, and then as we got into the 90s and the rise of the internet, and that happened because of money. Without investors, you don't get the technology. And without really interesting, idealistic, long-term investors, which are hard to find today, you don't get breakthrough technology. We had step change innovation in the 80s and 90s. It was just a massive thing. And these guys were the hottest VCs around in those days. It's John Doerr and Kleiner Perkins. John is standing. They invested in and helped start companies like Sun and Compaq and AOL and Netscape and Amazon and Google and It was like an incredible run they had. Really creative, interesting investors, and they were patient. Amazon took 5 years to make a profit. Today, most investments, they want to get out in 2 to 5 years. There's very little patience for really making hard science or really tough innovations. And Clinton, at that time, was on this is 95, and he's on a fundraising and campaign. This is during his campaign, and he stopped off in Silicon Valley to make the 10 most powerful people in Silicon Valley, and just blew them all away. He was so articulate. He knew everything about technology. It was incredible to listen to him. He answered everything they had to say, every challenge. All these guys around the table were Republicans, and they were talking about encryption technology issues and the restraint of that for overseas trade and all these different things. And he just like chapter and verse, and their jaws dropped, and they all wrote him checks for 50 grand. My wife and I were at this conference, and she saw this guy wearing an Amazon t-shirt. This is on the second day, but it turned out it was the other Amazon. She's from Brazil, and she was like, oh, let's go talk to that guy. This is really boring. We ended up on a gondola with Jeff Bezos going up Aspen Mountain, and he practiced his pitch on us for Amazon before he got funded. So it was really interesting. And when we got to the top of the mountain, he was, well, what do you think? And I'm like, you know what? It's going to be a huge hit. There's no doubt, but you're going to destroy my local bookstore. And he goes, oh, no, that won't happen. When you're starting a company, you have to go get money. You have to learn an elevator pitch. Does everybody have their elevator pitch ready? So this is listening to an elevator pitch. This is VC's reaction to this young guy's elevator pitch. This is Bill Joy, one of the true intellectual geniuses of the digital revolution, explaining the internet to William Randolph Hearst III in 1992. So you have two worlds of publishing technology in the same room. This is a collection of different companies and different pictures from, because I shot so many that I just threw into one edit here. This is Bill Gates saying, in the future, with digital technology, no one should ever pay more than $50 for a photograph. At a TED conference where 500 CEOs in 1992 heard this, and there was such a need for content. Oh, really? Thanks, Bill. He's a hero now, but he was a devil then. That's Ballmer. rallying his crew. This is not strategic. These are the golf courses that the CEO wants to play. I love this picture because this is one of the truly most creative minds in Silicon Valley. This is Ed Catmull, the CEO of Pixar and one of the driving forces from the beginning. I shot him in 1983, but this is just as Toy Story was about to be released, and he's having a meeting about it. Intel was making the world's fastest the fastest chip, the Pentium 3, at their fab in New Mexico. And I went down there and documented the workers there, and they were most of them were Pueblo Indians. And I would go home with them at the end of the workday, and they were farmers. But here they are having an exercise break. So it was really interesting, old world, new world. And you know, back then it was incredibly sexist world. It was a just really rough place for women. Oh wait, nothing's changed. And it really hasn't. Statistically, there's the exact same number of women working in Silicon Valley engineers as there was in 1989. How crazy is that? One thing, you can't have innovation without culture changing. So I was documenting, almost like a visual anthropologist, little things about the culture, because you know, originally it was 9 to 5, people wore coats and ties of these tech companies, but then all of a sudden you could be a hippie and wear whatever you want, no shoes, you could sleep under your desk, you could make your work hours, you could work at home. They didn't care as long as you were writing the code. And then you could bring your dog to work. That was a big deal. You could have, that's when the whole thing started with the free lunches, the free food, the massages, the laundry, all the things on the campus now that make you a slave to the campus were perks back then. Mark Andreessen, man, this is at the height. He, in a year, they went from 0 to 90% of the market share for the browser, for Netscape. And then Microsoft was like, oh, wait a minute. And then they crushed him, and a year later they had 10% of the market. It was like rise and fall. Yeah, down below there's like 10,000 employees having a water fight. And there they are. So this is the last company that I documented in the last story in the book. It's Samir Aurora, came from India when he was 18, inspired by Steve Jobs, ended up getting a job at Apple and worked his way up to be the right hand to Scully, left to start this company in 95. His team created the first software that would let anybody make their own web page. So they were riding that, it's just unleashing human creativity again at the exact moment where you could do that, where you could get a browser and put up a web page. And they were growing fast, but now, about 4 years later, 3 or 4 years later, they're having some issues because Microsoft has noticed them. And Microsoft is getting in the market with their own tools for creating web browsers. So I went into this meeting to document this meeting of Samir with his board and investors, and they're going to close another round and keep going. Instead, they turn to him and say, you're fired. We're going in a different direction. Here's, sign here, you get your shares. And this is the thing, in Silicon Valley, all the great founders, visionary founders, are all forced out, even Steve Jobs. That's the archetype. Well, he broke that. He refused to leave, and they said, Samir, don't be crazy. This happens all the time. You'll go start another company. Just sign and get out. He says, no, I haven't vision for this. You guys can leave. I said, Samir, we're going to shut you down. It's 4 o'clock on a Friday. You have 125 employees out there working their hearts out for you. For 4 years, they're going to lose everything. They're not going to get their shares when we do the IPO. Think about it. You have families out there. I'm not giving up my dream. I'm not giving up my vision. It was the most incredible thing I ever saw. Of 70 companies, I never saw anybody fight the VCs and go off the cliff like this. And they said, okay, we're shutting you down. They left. He had to go out into the room and make the speech. Whoever can work for free, please stay. I'm going to go and solve this. And he went home and he started calling everybody he knew. And the amazing thing is, the best part of the story is, well, a good part is that by Monday, noon, he had $10 million in the bank. Without lawyers, without due diligence, really incredible. And 3 months later, or less than that, he sold the company to IBM for $100 million, and he brought these guys back in on the deal, and they all made 1,000% return. The downside to this story is that IBM then, a year later, was running the company and decided to take it public. And at that point, it was March of 1999, and the market was very, very nervous. It was this bubble. And everybody kept saying, the bubble, when's the bubble going to go? And then they went public, and it was the first internet company, .com company, to close lower than they opened, or flat. They went down lower than they closed flat. And CNN, I was there, and CNN came on the TV while they were drinking champagne, and very sadly, CNN came on and said, is this the beginning of the end of the .com bubble? And it was. Because every IPO after that was flat or down until March of 2000, when trillions of dollars washed away and the whole thing just collapsed. And shareholder value and all these thousands of jobs were gone. It really was this noble cause, as Steve talked about it at the beginning, to invent tools, to improve lives, that through this amazing success just became this greed-fueled gold rush, just insane, which is, of course, unsustainable. So, of course, it crashed. That original animating spirit, the original idealism that I was interested in was gone. So I just ended my project. I was just really bummed. And I don't think you can put that in a business plan, by the way, idealism. But with that, I never saw a big breakthrough without that. Ironically, as Silicon Valley is burning to the ground, Steve Jobs is rising up like the phoenix. He sold his operating system, the Next Step operating system, to Apple for $400 million. He gets a seat on the board, takes over the whole thing, brings his incredible team from Next, and starts building and combines it with some people from Apple like Johnny Ive, who was there. Johnny Ive's first assignment was the Newton, by the way. I photographed him in '93. And he begins releasing one giant product after another. It was just an incredible comeback, probably the greatest comeback in business history. So before I get to the nuts and bolts of all this, when I give this talk, I usually end with a couple of thoughts that I can't help but share with you. I keep thinking about these things. You know, here's where we're at. Well, we're at the end of democracy in America, but let's not digress. Here's where we're at. Here's where we're at. Everyone thinks this is a super innovative time. Tons of innovation. That's what we think. That's what Silicon Valley thinks. And yes, it's innovative, but they're all iterations. Every product we use today, from outer space to your kitchen, the foundational root work of that was done in the 80s and 90s by the people in my book. Seriously. Or from the 70s in some cases. And why do we know that? Because the stack of technologies are becoming integrated and things are kind of starting to work together. Like an app like Uber couldn't work without all these different technologies becoming mature enough to be commercially viable. So what it means is that we're coming down the backside of a 30-year wave cycle of technology development. I learned about this from Steve. I had no clue. I'm a photographer. So that's when stuff gets good. When you're riding down that back wave, that means things are starting to get. It takes 20 years to be an overnight success in Silicon Valley, according to Paul Saffo. It takes a long time. You know, the Newton from '93 to the iPhone was a long time. It's just really, really hard to invent this stuff. So, what does that mean? It means we're in this cycle of churn where the stuff's getting better and better, and we're seeing all these new products that are iterations. Okay, but it also means we're coming up to this new wave. There's this massive new wave of technology coming with. And it's already here with AI and machine learning and robotics and sensors and 3D printing and nanotech and quantum computing, if they ever figure that out. Genomics and biotech is happening, robotics. All this stuff is happening, some of it faster than others. None of it has really scaled yet, like the PC scale. It took 10 years for the PC to scale. A lot of it is going to require super hard science to do that. A lot of that science money is inside large corporations. It used to not be. It used to be government-funded hard science, and then the VCs could come in and productize that stuff. So we don't know if the quantum computer that Google has will ever come out to the market or ever benefit us. That's the difference between inventing stuff inside a large company. Anyway, we all have a role to play, and we need to be aware of this technology. Otherwise, we're like sheep to slaughter. These are tools. It can be a hammer, can build a house, to tear it down. So the Singularity is coming. And whether you think that's really cool or utterly terrifying, they're talking about uploading our brains into the hive mind, Ray Kurzweil, and we'll live forever. That's when computers gain consciousness. I mean, I don't want to live in a hive mind, and I just think people need to start paying attention because we get great benefit from the technology, but we also have to think about what's happening to us, what's happening to data, what's happening to our privacy. And the other issues that I'm concerned with is education. China graduated approximately 2 million engineers. We put out less than 200,000 last year, 50,000 which were computer scientists. So there's millions of unfilled jobs in the United States at this moment today. 2 to 3 million, depending if you look at the Department of Labor or some universities. The issue with investment I already talked about. Without long-term investment on hard science, you won't get those breakthroughs. They'll happen somewhere else. They'll happen in China. China did 2 million startups last year. And I mean, actually, I'm thrilled that Silicon Valley technology went out and scaled up the world. That's something that's important to me. But now we're watching the US economy getting hollowed out because of the short-term thinking that's permeated everything from Wall Street to government. And of course, immigration. Silicon Valley, something like 52% of all the companies between 95 and 2005 are immigrants. All that creative innovation is now, when they graduated from MIT, they have to go back to their home country, and they're bringing that creativity there. This is our immigration policy. 74% of Silicon Valley computer and math workers today are foreign-born. So it's just a crazy, crazy time. And history matters. So you have to look back at that, but only if you don't want to repeat the mistakes of the past. And Silicon Valley, a lot of my friends, they don't care to look back. They're all worried about the next big deal. But you better believe Steve knew his history. He knew upon whose shoulders he was standing. And he would find them. He'd call them up. He'd go, like, suck every bit of knowledge out of their brains, put it into his brain, bring it to his team. And that's how it helped him innovate, by going back and looking at history. We don't really care about history in this country anymore. Maybe I'm generalizing. So who will be the next Steve Jobs? And where will she come from? Well, she could come from anywhere, because there's the good news with this new wave is there's this incredible, amazing amount of hungry young entrepreneurs and innovators all over the world. There's just this hunger to create and invent right now that's being unleashed. So where I'm going with the project right now is that we are hunting right now for the coolest, most amazing stories around the world to do the next generation. And we've been we're working on a TV series and a documentary. The TV series is going to come first. We're very close to that. And our criteria is crazy. They have to be crazy. They have to be idealists. They have to want to invent something. They have to be pushing boundaries with their technology. They want to improve lives, improve the world with their technology. And they have to have a sustainable long-term business model. It's not an app. You can't, in 2 years, you can do apps or games. You can't do healthcare. You can't do anything meaningful beyond apps or games. So you need long-term investing. But anyway, we're looking for this talent, and we're finding, I've already started shooting. This is from a hackathon here in New York. It was one of the first things I shot with my Leica SL when I switched from Nikon, and so much fun. But when you talk to these young entrepreneurs, I get hope again. I may have sounded a little cynical and bitter a minute ago, just a little. But man, when you talk to these young innovators and entrepreneurs, they don't see limits. They're on fire. They're going to do amazing stuff. They have to break through the constraints that the system, the ecosystem has put on them. And what I want to do with the project, I get a lot of feedback from these young people. They come to my talks, they email me from India, from all over. And what I want to do is share these stories, which we've been doing. And it's having an impact because they're getting inspiration from that. They're learning some of the lessons from that day, which the number one lesson for me as a freelance photographer is never give up. And that was what I learned from Steve. No matter how bad it is, you have to believe in yourself and your own ideas despite all evidence to the contrary. You just got to. You have to fight for your ideas. And I think this project for me is either going to kill me or we're going to prove this model. But at night, late at night, I think of Steve telling me, one of the last things he said to me was, "Don't worry, Doug, you'll have fun with these pictures someday." They're great. And I'm like, all right, I'll keep going. Because it hasn't been easy. The project has been really, really hard. Despite the success we've had, it's been brutally hard. And it's become my mission. And the reason it's a mission, it's beyond photos. I did this story, and it's connecting with people. And the feedback I'm getting has convinced me it's worth the trouble and the pain and all the money we've put into it. So I usually end with this slide. It's basically the people I photographed were on a mission. And they had to have a mission because it's just too hard to walk through that fire. Money is not enough for people to innovate, to make breakthrough innovation. They'll walk away, particularly today. They have to believe in it. It has to be a cause. You have to align, and this is my my lesson as a photographer, I had to align what I was most excited about shooting with what I was doing for a living. And that was a process I went through over the last 15 years to figure that out, how to merge art and commerce. But these people created meaning in their lives by putting it all on the line for something they really believed in. So I learned a lot from Silicon Valley. And I think, you know, many of you today, and maybe people watching online, have already had an impact on the world with your photographs. And many of you are working to do just that as storytellers. What you do matters. If you're successful, you could affect lives. I think visual storytelling, the power of visual storytelling, it's more important now than it's ever been. Plus, there's so many media outlets, there's more hunger for content than there's ever been before. We actually, I mean, it's such a difficult time with assignment photography, commercial, and journalism. Everything's been disrupted, right? Everything is kind of broken. It's really hard to figure out. You get more money being a consultant than being a photographer. It's really hard. But I think we're in the driver's seat. Content creators, people who have a story to tell, we have power that we can harness and use to our advantage to make a living. And yeah, I'm getting paid to give talks. I give this talk to corporations. And maybe I'll get more money from that next year than shooting advertising. Maybe I'll get this TV series locked down and I'll be a director next year. But the point is, with this model, I can create different revenue streams that will keep us going. One thing will work here or another thing won't, but something else will work. The book, the film, they all go together. Anyway, I think we need to take a page from the original fearless geniuses, you know, adapt the latest technology to tell the stories we want to tell, and find the new model for making a living. Let's go catch that next wave ourselves and make a difference in the world. It's not impossible. I think we can do it. So let's go do it. Thanks, guys.